you define as a family office?
Yes. So this is an interesting question. I think you know it when you see it. We have probably a handful of family offices that we deal with, and they are easily definable because they're up around $1 to $2 billion each. They have much more formal structures. They have independent directors. They have, in many cases, sorry?
1 to 200 million?
That's where it gets a little trickier because you probably can suggest that clients that come in around the 50 to 100 million mark can easily have aspirations of a family office. So the industry talks of them in terms of being potentially a family office or moving in the direction of a family office, but they may not have all the criteria that you would assign to a family office here and now. And what they're looking for, I guess, is assistance with that journey. So that's part of the value add that an advisor or a consultant can bring to the party, and it's partly to do with the investment proposition that they adopt, things like developing an investment policy statement. So in the retail space, we're used to obviously doing risk profiling of clients. Well, this is sort of analogous to that, but taking it to the next level where you basically are developing a document that really sets down the investment parameters, the governance framework for investing. And that's something that, a lot of family offices, or indeed developing family offices, probably want to see. And then, I guess the interplay between stakeholders is often something that you see within a family office, as opposed to, say, an individual high net worth investor where there's not just one stakeholder that you're dealing with, but there's potentially a number of stakeholders. They're not always on the same page. They have different investment objectives. They have different investment time horizons. That starts to take on the semblance of a family office. So,
and can you give some colour to who those stakeholders might be?
Yeah, well, look, the stakeholders obviously within the family. So it might be the partner of the patriarch or the matriarch who's made the money. Then it's potentially the children, and then family of the children. And so I quipped in the session earlier about a bit like dealing with a program succession or something like that. But in some cases, it can be very complex because you've got to understand that the attitude of children towards issues such as the time frame of investment is very different. They're looking much longer term. They might have sustainability objectives that the patriarch or the matriarch might not have. They're trying to wrestle control and so impart some direction on the assets, and the patriarch or the matriarch might not want to give that up. And I have sat around tables where this has been a real wrestle occurring. So then you get situations where that's really been formalised already, and really there is much more of a structure. And we talked earlier about an example that we were working with an advice business where they were engaged by the family office. We were asked to support them through that process, and that was a much more developed structure where the wealth event had happened a fair while ago. There was an investment approach that was embedded. The problem was that it was spread out across 5 different investment or financial advisors. Each had been given a portion of assets, and it hadn't really been coordinated at all. So the exercise for the advice business that we were working with was to really do an audit of that existing structure, to provide an asset allocation overlay, really to formalise an investment policy statement that we helped with, and really then to go about implementing that. And that's in train at the present time.
I might sort of ask the question about how you engage with them and how you charge, just to sort of flush out really how different it is. Because we've been on a bit of a journey in this workshop from the underserved, let's call it in between high net worth and mass affluent. We've spoken about the needs of the high net worth, and we're now very much getting into the family offers.
Yeah.
But yeah, you've certainly got a perspective on what's probably the best way of engaging to be able to appropriately service this type of client base, given its complexity.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think from our perspective, obviously we're dealing at the very upper end of the family office market. I mentioned before, there's probably only 150, 200 families that sit in that space in Australia that we would probably actively go after directly. And the type of advice that we would provide, there are cases where we might be the only investment consultant in the room, but quite often that's not the case. We're having to deal with a lot of other advisors, so legal advisors, accounting advisors, potentially other investment consultants providing advice as well. So it may be that you're given a portion of assets to manage to a particular mandate, or you're focusing on a particular asset class or a particular role and responsibility. So one financial advisor or consultant might be assigned to look after the asset allocation, one might be assigned to look after manager selection or something like that. But, that's really at that top end. And when you are engaging at a level below that, where perhaps the bulge of the high net worth family office market is, and we might be talking, 50 or 30, 40, 50 million and above, up to, 1 to 200 million, then I think there are certain similarities, but you are probably also dealing with a client that maybe has understood how they have made their wealth, but they don't necessarily understand how to go about formalising the investment process. That's what they really need help developing, that linkage, and that's where I think an advice relationship can be very important at its inception. Also in terms of, as the example I gave, cleaning up a lot of the mess that has grown up organically, where the family office has sort of gone through this life cycle, if you like, where they've gotten past that early nascent stage and they've assigned all these mandates out there to different financial advisors, and then found themselves in an awful pickle because they don't know exactly what they're invested in. They don't know what the performance of the assets are that they're invested in, because there's no consolidated reporting on it. And so someone coming in to sort of tidy up after the event is actually a very common occurrence.
So I've heard you say just on this pricing that sometimes there's a lot of work around trying to get all of the things together around reporting, which is often what's not the case for, let's call it the underserved or the mass affluent. But also just the frequency of contact.
Yeah.
Again, it's not uncommon for the audience to have a retainer-based client that you see somewhere between once a year to twice a year sort of thing. But that's not necessarily the case in this context.
It's absolutely not the case in this context. They will contact you when they want to contact you. And you can't say to them, well, actually, I'm only charging for this level of contact. They will reach out to you because you are managing a fair swathe of their wealth. And so you need to think about that before you enter it. And this is one of the points I tried to stress earlier. Generally, we find that advisors in this space, when they're getting into it and they're coming across clients like this, they're undercharging because they're coming from a lens of dealing with the retail mass affluent market and trying to sort of leverage it up. I can tell you that our observation, private wealth groups in this space, is that charges of 1 to 1.5% of assets is not uncommon. Now, when you think about that, that's what, $500,000 on a $50 million program or asset base. That's a significant amount of money. Now, that does take an account of the platform, which is incidental cost, the investment solution, which you can get quite significant fee savings for clients of that order if you've got the right sort of connections, but it still leaves a fairly significant amount for the advice piece. And then we see a lot of advisors, they say, well, should I charge 20,000, 30? No. This is a client that, that they will pay for service, but they will want the service at a high level and a platinum service, effectively. So set your mind around that. What is your charge out? What's a fair charge out rate? Work out how much you're likely to be spending doing it, and then double it, because they will always exceed your expectations.
Questions at the back?
With that kind of fee structure, especially where it's bundled up the product and platform type cost, and you mentioned before there might be some, duplication between one advisor looking after the broad group asset allocation, for example. they might have a mandate for a structure or a particular asset class. Do you find that there might be duplication of fees in that kind of situation?
Duplication of fees. Well, what generally happens and what we've seen is that, and I use the example of the case study that we've been dealing with recently because it is so typical. All right, it ticks all the boxes in terms of what we often see. 5 advisors advising this client, each is being given a portion of money and you look after that without any reference to anyone else. No one is actually dealing with the asset allocation. So and that's where the group that we were working with or are working with was brought in to sit over the top of that to try and get a bit more cohesion about it. But there were 3 advice businesses there actually doing Australian equity, direct portfolio. I mean, a complete overlap. Now, they're doing it on different portions of wealth, so they're not getting double charged, but you're not getting efficiency from that either. Yeah, that's not unusual at all. I would suggest to you that you will come across clients like that will almost invariably have more than one financial advisor because they're just not trusting enough to give all their money to one client. You may or may not have visibility on what that other advisor is advising on. But what I think the approach is, well, what can we bring to the table that's a little different? It's not just Australian equities, it's perhaps access to private equity, venture capital, direct infrastructure. These are sorts of really interesting areas that these types of clients are underinvested in, want access to, but they really need access to good quality strategies, and that's really the problem. There's a lot of strategies that you can buy, not all of them are worth investing.
What was the feedback from some of those clients as to why they went down that path in the first instance? Was it maybe element of trust and trying before they buy and fully commit to an advisor and shopping around, or were they dissatisfied with, the advice they were getting and, shopping around, or,
I think it happened by osmosis over time. Basically, they knew someone at private wealth firm XYZ, developed a relationship here, managed 15 million for me, and they developed that sequentially over a period of time. I suspect also a theme through this is that they really probably haven't developed a level of trust enough to rely on one financial advisor. So it's not unusual, for example, for mandate to be split in 2, where both are given exactly the same mandate and they're traded off against each other. They're benchmarked against each other effectively to see how they go. So, it's probably an element of a lack of trust and probably a lot to do with just circumstance. It's just grown up that way, and at no point up until now has someone stopped and said, well, actually, this is not the most efficient way of doing it.
When you are in that situation, you're essentially swimming in your lane. You're very aware that there's other people swimming in other lanes. What's your approach to sort of manage I suppose the interdependency for the client with the other advisors, but in the end, hopefully put your best foot forward with the family office to add value. So how do you sort of engage in that context?
I mean, ideally, you'd all sit down together and sort of plan it out and say, well, look, okay, we'll focus on this bit, you focus on that bit, but it doesn't happen that way most generally. Unless the client actually gives the authority for you to get access to other information, you're not even going to have visibility on what the other advisors investing in or providing advice on. Now, there are plenty of occasions that we might get brought in, or another advisor gets brought in to sit over the top, as I explained with this case study, where they are actually specifically given authority to look inside, but it is reluctantly given. Groups, financial advice, private wealth groups don't open the kimono very readily in this regard. So it can be quite difficult. So all I'd say to you is deal from your strength, okay? You have certain areas of strength that each of you may have. Bring that to the table, and where you don't have areas of strength, engage parties to work with you. So unlike a lot of groups, we're not going after, the client base that's probably less than $300, $400, $500 million. It's just not our market. That leaves an enormous scope. And the way we work then is to work through advisors. We help them to win business because that's a win for them, that's a win for us. We don't directly engage them. We can provide a lot of support. We're not the only ones doing it, but that's an area that we specialise in. We can give a lot of IP in terms of private equity deals and opportunities. We can direct infrastructure, direct property, and really good pricing of those deals. That's the sort of thing that I think does resonate really strongly. A lot of groups in this space really focus on the direct Australian equity. But if you see replication of capability across different advisors, it's generally in that direct Australian equity space. And that's fine. It's an important box to tick because a lot of these clients do like to have a direct Australian equity exposure. They like the tangibility of having direct assets, and one of the attractions is if they change their mind, they can take the assets with them. So they can be moved around pretty easily rather than in and out of trusts. But the downside of that is that there's a lot of them doing it. So what else can you bring to the table that actually provides a different slant to that?
Okay. You spoke a bit about working with other advisors. How are you finding you're building this market for your firm?
It's extremely relationship driven. I think others might have spoken about the not-for-profit market. Now that's a market that is parallel to the family office market, very similar sized clients, in that mezzanine where it's sort of low-end institutional, high-end wholesale, I guess, but a very different approach where that's based largely around tenders, formal tender processes, RFPs, requests for proposals, and you have to get on that list, you have to complete a tender. Normally you're one of 8 that might be invited to tender. Family offices don't operate in that manner at all. It's relationship driven. And generally we find the way we get referrals is by an existing client having a friend or a contact that they refer to us, so it's a reverse inquiry, or they put us onto them and we make the inquiry or on the front foot and we develop a relationship. It's not so much a competitive landscape in that, yes, there may be others that are advising that client, but we're not asked to formally tender in that process. They will ask us, what our credentials are. They want to know what we can bring to the table that's a little different, what our pricing structure is, and so on and so forth. But it's very much based on a one-to-one engagement to really, win their confidence through that process.
Questions from the audience at the back again?
Another one that probably relates back to that multiple advisor arrangement. And I think in the prior session you talked about multi-jurisdictional type assets and structures and so on. Australia's got a pretty small universe as far as things like PE, impact investing and so on. Would it be up to someone like JANA, for example, to go find those solutions offshore or engage with an advice firm offshore to deal with best of breed type products to make available?
This is a really good point. So the opportunity set for these asset classes from an large institutional client lens is quite rich. There is a lot of private equity opportunities. There's a lot of direct infrastructure. There's a lot of direct property opportunities, offshore based. The problems are that in many cases they're domiciled in Caymans, or Luxembourg or Ireland, for example. Fine for a superannuation fund that's several $1 billion. Normally they have minimum investment amounts of $5 million US, $10 million US, right? Fine for that type of client base. But it doesn't really help this client segment. Even a client that might be several $100 million is going to struggle to get access because of tax prohibition. If they're an Australian taxpayer going into a Caymans fund, does produce adverse tax consequences. But they can't afford $5 million US minimum investment. How do you get a diversified investment program out of that? So one of the opportunities, I think, for fund managers is to potentially launch Australian feeder funds, and we're seeing that now, that is increasingly a focus where it's feeding into that offshore trust, but it's available in Australia. It might only be $100,000 or $200,000 minimum investment. It's potentially platform available, still has the underlying illiquidity, so that's not changed, but it's just more accessible. And I think it's also an opportunity set for groups such as JANA, where we have such an enormous buying power and engagement with these fund managers to actually work with them to bring those trusts to Australia. And that's one of the things I think that over the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to see a significant opportunity emerge. So I think it's small at the moment, but I think it is going to grow.
Probably one last question from me, which is, let's just say we, in our social connections, we think we come across someone that might fit this market, and we do want to holler for you, Michael. What does that engagement look like in engaging you? Because we obviously want to make sure that our next step is robust and well supported. But what does that engagement look like between the financial advisor and JANA?
Yeah, so I head up the family office wealth partnerships business, which wealth partnerships is really engaging with advisors, private wealth businesses, and they're our clients. Family offices is self-evident. But I think, you get a situation like that. One of our private wealth groups that we're working with comes to us and say, well, look, you're providing us advice more generally. You might be managing a managed account program for us. It might be an MDA program, a bespoke SMA program. We've got a particular client. Can you help us with that? And we will provide them support as part of that overall engagement. One-off situation, it could be based around, well, look, okay, we're going to charge that client a fee. JANA will charge you a fee for supporting your engagement, and it's done on a fixed fee arrangement. Another approach is that we have a range of JANA trusts that are wholesale only. We only use them for our family office clients and for our not-for-profit clients, and you can use those. And the engagement that we had with this advice business, they're actually using, they've developed their own managed account program where the advisor to it, they're using some of our JANA trusts, particularly areas like direct infrastructure and alternatives, which they would struggle to get access to themselves, as part of the solution, and it works for everyone.
Okay. Toby, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do, which is, you've touched on it before, Michael, which is the characteristics of the family offices, certainly in Australia, is, somebody made the money, and that somebody is, still alive typically. They've got a certain personality, which is they know how they made their money. They were a risk taker. Think things present themselves as good opportunities. They go, hey, I've just seen a 200-acre block of land. Mm-hmm. I know that's going to get rezoned. Yep. So I'm going to need 50 million back. So, to what extent do these sort of best laid plans of mice and advisors sort of fall at the hurdle of I've had a good idea?
Yeah, look, and it's not just the patriarch or the matriarch that might have that. It's the kids that have got this brilliant idea for a tech startup or something like that. And you can have the conversation, explaining how that's really not a good idea. I'd suggest that's probably a short road to, being evicted as the investment advisor or the financial advisor. I think the best approach, in my view, is to probably sequester different portions of funds. So you've got funds that are there basically for long-term endowment style investment. There might be funds set aside for a philanthropic type of pursuit. There's money that's, or funds that are there for funding current consumption. And there might be funds set aside for venture capital, effectively, of this sort of nature. And you accept that that's something that the best you can do is ring fence it and build around it, and really try and complement what, again, they know how to take risk. So if you're dealing with a patriarch, it's no good telling them, you know, that's a really bad investment. They've spent their life making, I guess, risky investments or building a business based on taking capital risks themselves. You can't teach them to suck eggs. What you can say is, well, look, okay, that's great, but what about a pool of assets that's more for long-term, multi-generational purposes, that's got a more sober, more diversified investment approach, and view it from a complementary perspective. And I think that is probably a more creative way of dealing with a situation like that.
Okay. Any last questions, folks? No? Please give our warm thanks to Michael Karagianis.